Dana DeGiulio, Nefertiti for the Blind. A small animal approaches its reflection in a window shot with sun and is slapped back by the glass. A perlocutionary act is an utterance taken at the level of its consequences. Yelling fire in a crowd is illegal because the word instantiates alarm even if there's no fire and you only meant to help. Saying here produces the feeling of gone like the index of a moving body marking a surface says now and means was. The Louvre previously held lepers and dogs, and art is just the same grief bounding after you day after day, bringing you its wet toy. Anything held still is an excerpt, the exposed rebar of syntax or a comma, put to help you breathe. Warm gray morning, black SUV, white belly of goose, brake light, bright wet guts blew up all over the street. Feathers, steam, are any of these the words we know? Underbelly, they say, foot pushed up against wet sand. You point this out in bright sun, that the eyelid protects the aqueous body from the introduction of hostile particles, but not from having seen. Newton, having nobody else to look to, stuck a needle into his own eye to see if blind spots were actual material. The black marks on the concrete are spit. There are reports of seismic pressure straining the ankles of the David. The gulls are begging. The ear is open. You can't help it. A human Kleenex box tits like a billboard all night mouthing erase me, all of it. No use for these stragglers, slick and sluggish, limping their armor back over the hill in regular light to assemble expertly into a name and drop like a roach onto the neck of another woman who gets up but not to go. Sympathy used otherwise only for the back of protest signs. Duct tape, yardstick, woman at window, light pencil grid, but the spacing was off, the glitter too much, all the things you wake up just to fear, or any of these the worst days of the century. Open, given, open. If I ever would have given you anything, it was Pompeii outside, yawning, malignant, off-white, an attendant palm. Their holes, the casts of Pompeii. Ash hardened around the bodies before they desiccated, and in 1,000 years someone poured plaster into the little caves, and here we are. The dog, the lovers, the kid with his fists against his skull, a dozen arched backs. Does it float is not a terrible question. And they're fleeing a diet of gulls slapped into the pavement all day, a dispersal of white into its constituent parts. Its altitude, not velocity, determines do they break their necks. A little monk stuck like a thermometer next to the sea, the styrofoam houses abandoned to mold, pulse on the finger, all that green. Available materials. Fresh hell, citizens, spring and all, Pina Bausch, no lease on life, pool, dial, attendant, Medusa, ecce homo, ecce mono, Antigone, 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 stub toe of empire or its equivalent, headless body and topless bar, universal furnace, hold still, hold still. Black rubber bands left on mattress after mattress, oh, 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 after the fact go to the world on wrists, oh, oh, against nothing, and Ulysses tells Cyclops that his name is nobody, and Cyclops says, oh, then I will eat nobody last, and that will be your gift. Other uses include level final aid for kitchen table, repository for incisions as on sand of grocery list, math for bills, leaf for empty cube or small pig with curled tail drawn in margin, receipts, small stray hair, killer of all insects except spiders who are gentled back under the door. There's a mummy on its back in the Metropolitan Museum of Art with an inserted panel portrait of a youth, its occupant. Anonymous painter, dead kid, 2,000 years, small hairs on upper lip, a white fleck in each open eye, the body's still here like an empty sock, or those pets nobody came home to that pissed almost through the floor. A day bandaged tight enough to float, and all the tension of a metronome. Even if you couldn't do it, you'd promise to, swaddle a loved body over and over until the tape ran out, but it would be easier for a stranger. The verb tense of all touch is future perfect. The face is turned partially away, scaled slightly too small, like he's already taken a first step backward. They had trouble in the Middle Ages understanding the synecdoche character of the portrait, trouble accepting that a person represented at a single moment could stand in for a whole life. A boy cropped off at the neck, part for the whole, like he came to your window. Emmett Till's mother had them feigning in supermarket checkout lines, the thin pages of Jet magazine unable to hold her boy. Open like nothing, the skin on a blister rubbed on and on. All faces defy anyone to make them flat. Egyptian funeral portraiture enacts openly the leave-taking of all representation, the image scaling its retreat from what it held, slowly, slowly, pointing at our awful speed. I rub my own thumb across my bottom teeth, which is not the same. A fresh manicure ticks against the glass. There are two versions of the narcissist story, one where he falls in love with himself and drowns, and one where he mistakes himself for another and drowns. Sympathy is harder than empathy, which is impossible, this being both the tragedy and the relief of love, that I am actually not you. The tour guide had them laughing. You're a child, Sontag says, if you don't look, and a child if you don't look away. X and Y intersect at origin 0, 0, an idea we have from Descartes. At 0, your anger is ordinary, and 1 person 1 equals 1 person I until we are 0. Lear's oh, oh, oh howled up into the rain, but held like he was looking at it, a marvel of having accomplished nothing of something. The ground against which any figure is thrown determines its visibility, but not whether or not it's there. A man flees openly across the proscenium and is dead before he gets there. The witness videotaping the action does not interrupt the scene. He explained later, I wanted him to know I was there for him. A tree bisects the frame, stubbornly vertical. A boy races towards the vanishing point and is dead before he gets there, and this is the philosophical question of painting. Is it small or is it far? At worst, we already know, we don't care, we can't learn, we aren't anything, we took your face, we couldn't refuse, and are dry, a pre-recorded thunderstorm off stage on a loop, the end of which is signaled by a barking dog. Hugo Ball performed Caruana the same week they started using mustard gas. Matisse painted lemons on a pewter plate in 1926. There are 3 lemons depicted a little smaller than actual size, and a 4th partially hidden by a leaf, a table tipped slightly toward you, a few more leaves, and a red and white floral printed sheet dropped behind. The sheet opens in the top left quadrant to reveal a small blue triangle contained in which is the rest of the whole world. Stunned gull, stunned white dog, not you, Exeunt sits in an aggregate of holes, holding up the white so you can see it for what it is, a field of dirty feathers. It, like you, numbs easily, and over, you pushed your dirty eyes at its bee sting, understanding it won't cancel the shock but replace it, and that this is only temporary. Once as a kid, I had to gut this sink full of fish, and there was a hook left in one, and I cut myself on it but didn't notice, up to the elbows in fish blood and freezing water and flat, wet eyes, until I pulled my hand out of the sink into the air and felt my wound open, screeching its tiny hurt as on a kazoo. The first strike demolished an office building. The second took out an entire city park. People have been found using the rubble of Palmyra to rebuild their houses, ancient columns pulverized into use as bricks. That which is forest becomes a field, bright green. The kid tips backward from the weight of her backpack into the snow. Maupassant hated the Eiffel Tower so much he went there every day because it was the only place in Paris where he couldn't see it. Joan Didion asked what there is to grieve 19 years after the death of someone who died at 20. A stranger was placing a wilted lei on a grave in Hawaii, but Joan was the one there waiting. Children and sweethearts are also called lei, and it means any set of objects strung together to be worn, and it's used to welcome tourists, and fragrance fills the room indoors and gets reabsorbed outdoors, and is not a thing you can keep. The t-shirt wadded up tight in a plastic bag even years later. All I do is go where someone else was, sometimes where we were, waiting sometimes for us to come back, and we don't come back, not even for a moment, to find out what evening it's sung. Nobody ever asks me to stop. Hard as I look for you, fingers like a fish in a dry sink, whole body mouthing open for your hooks everywhere. Hard as I, nothing, flopping freely in hard gold air, reading is hunting. Sometimes there is nowhere else to take your love. I go back looking for everyone, for you, others, strangers, for Sandra Bland once too, for like a year. Try to say the names of the living in museums, her face half mistaken for Whitney Houston's. I go back cored and empty, and you're not there, not there. Nobody is. Gutted stage, all obdurate, grinning glass, not sugar, no substitutions, not the breakaway stuff I'm used to, crashing through coffee tables and smashing wine bottles over my head and come up smiling. We're shifting in our seats, our phones are off, we're ready, we're the show. A little cloud of dust from a prop gun shifting slowly. Gloucester's gouged-out eyes are usually played by eggs dropping, bright red yarn unspooling from the actor's fists, aghast agape again and again. 8 shows a week, everyone looks like someone else, and nobody taken out of time is at home here among the living, pawing at this zoo for their quick and their dead. Later, he leaps blind off a small curb he mistakes for a cliff, having heard the sea, and sprains at worst an ankle, and Edgar says, "Oh, steep, horrible steep, a miracle, sir, you survived that terrible fall." To say us and them is pointless. This world is flat and what we came for. A traveler once asked the king of the Lacedaemonians the number of his population, and the king presented him with a huge empty bowl fashioned from a single coin taken from each citizen, saying, "This is how many we are." Substitutions have to take place to get things to mean. It happens quietly without a picture of the artist arranging their delicate heads, saying actual names or fire. I almost drowned you out yelling stay. I almost couldn't be there for it going after years of muttering, "Oh, sweethearted objects," but only the ones small enough to steal. The funeral stela, the girl touching a small bird to her lips, a cracked attic vase with a woman washing, her towel like the breeze took it. Half torso like a wad of gum, the helmet with a hole in it, your ankle, 1,000 beautiful ancient asses, a leaf and stone, a fucked up infant satyr the size of my stomach, its busted mouth and polyps on its neck from too much pleasure, the jars with heads for holding all organs but your useless brain which they pulled out through the nose, a palm bending its spine over Ajax, kneeling Nut, the goddess Nut, whose body is the entire firmament arched over us beyond anything we can touch or see or have or lose. In 1970, the Weather Underground bombed Rodin's thinker off his perch outside the Cleveland Museum of Art with dynamite. The explosion, which happened at night, melted the bronze feet and it dropped headfirst off its pedestal, cracking the public sidewalk. In 1972, Laszlo Toth left a guardrail in the Vatican and took a hammer to the Pietà, breaking off the Madonna's nose and left arm, shattering her hand and part of her left eyelid, and leaving nearly 100 fragments of stone scattered on the floor of the basilica, some no larger than a fingernail. The damaged thinker is now indoors, and the restored Pietà is behind bulletproof glass. It's one thing to encounter another armless Achilles, the armies of headless white women in cabinets of stray feet and broken columns with polyps on their necks from too much weather, but the argument to leave the damaged Pietà is an example of our violent times, and quickly. An American tourist who grabbed a shard off the floor in the chaos accompanying Laszlo's arrest mailed it anonymously home to Rome. They glued the Madonna carefully back together, and now the glass shows you your reflection and the flashbulbs go off like stupid miracles. I'm tired of saying beautiful. Let the happy things fall. There's an old Memorex commercial where Ella Fitzgerald breaks a glass with her voice. Is it live was the question. It wasn't. The point was to demonstrate the quality of the cassette tape's recorded playback. You can try it yourself at home. If you flick a glass with your fingernail and are able to pitch your voice to its resonant frequency, it will shatter. The sound waves slide between the particles and push them away from each other. There's an ancient loaf of bread in the Met. It's 4,000 years old in a case about ankle height in the Sackler Wing, which is named after a famous manufacturer of prescription opioids, which also houses the Temple of Dendor, a building purchased from Egypt on the condition it remained, quote, always visible to the public, which is why they put it in an atrium overlooking the park and a playground with toy pyramids and hollow polyethylene lions in a slide. In 2018, the artist Nan Goldin and other protesters threw hundreds of empty pill bottles into the atrium's water feature and let them float. In 2006, the artist Malachi Richter lit himself on fire to protest the Iraq War. He died on a highway off-ramp near Chicago at the base of a 7-ton abstract rendering of fire, a public sculpture called The Flame of the Millennium, holding a sign that read, "Thou shalt not kill." 5 years later, the war either ended or it didn't. There's a deflated football in the British Museum, shot full of holes. I go home to light my candles. You have to learn to lose and leave that instead of another pointless pious victory like when they tossed Jezebel against the wall and her head split open, making the first abstract painting. Partita for Solo Mosquito. The neighbors quietly fucking. Someone kicks a plastic bottle up the street. The radiator empties itself into the afternoon, and you hold the spine up like the seam of an infant skull. You cannot push it. It is growing. There's a test when they're born. A sudden bang. Did they startle? I never found out who made it, but there's an old painting of the Virgin Mary with freckles on her nose. Another, the Duccio Madonna, small, 14th century, bruised gold, they say is the first one where the mother and child address each other instead of the viewer. Their faces inches apart, tipped toward each other, and the baby lifts the veil like discovering his mother's face forever, which introduces the idea of the witness, your any plea for intercession and interruption of this ordinary act on which much of the world hung or hangs. All the nighttime televisions blinking blue at once, a lighter flicks in the rain, you're drawing your I love yous on the wrong wet window. Their faces tipped toward each other, held apart by hard cold, faces facing, but her gaze lifts off stage into a predicate where she and we know what the baby can't. Not yet, ragging his little fist, that we are helplessly in time. The hardest part is when they say the shooter, like the word was already there, ready for its debut, clambering up out of the damp basement like sound from the lungs. The bottom edge of the picture is marked by candle burns. John Berger, for all his hardball, ends ways of seeing by claiming Vermeer's girl holds not scales for weighing gold between her fingers, but the moment. He lets himself say she holds the moment between her fingers. A spider calmly crosses the face of a peach like it came from the inside. To say that you are helpless is to admit you might be helped, or at least that you remember your conditions having been otherwise, a time before you were helpless. Starting from the infants are you there, which issues from the same indignation required of all action. All cries are hopeful, and even after our skulls harden into speech, it is the same question. This whole helpless grid is a site of interdependency, and the saying of no, too, is optimistic because it posits things might be otherwise and opens a little fissure in the order of things like the pupil which lets light in. They say that Michelangelo could see the form inside of a block of stone and worked to release it. He called the forms angels and lived in a hell where he had to set them free. Painting is the opposite of this. You bury the angel, you have to, especially if you don't believe. I tell students that you don't fill the white surface, you empty it of history and authority and orthodoxy and language, of its ideas and hopes and punishments and substitutions, but I am lying. It is for burying them so hard they don't erupt and kill you or anyone else. It's for turning them to stone. You looked at me, you looked right at me and said that's not love. Something happened once. I was teaching in Prague and we were all tired one night near the end, and a student picked me up piggyback and jumped us off a cement ledge into the river. Hitting the freezing black water made me hang on tighter, suddenly awfully heavy, and we were sinking like I could see us, and it was so hard to figure out how to disentangle for the shock of being carried, and then of suddenly holding someone down, and we came up gasping 12 feet apart, laughing but not really. Something else happened years later. There's a big illuminated medieval singing book in the museum in Chicago left open on its back in a glass case almost the size of a windshield. One afternoon, my friend leaned over and sang it to us, and the scrawny angels gave up their heavy blocks of notation and let them float. It's this: if you feel safe, then you are. There is no other record of this day, but those little blocks are free forever. Like when you start to understand that love takes away, it breaks the glass, it puts your hand in its mouth and closes your eyes, and you can feel the darkness shining. Before this, the crickets shivering all morning, the air conditioner deafening another office, another skylit stone floor, another hospital pounding away with its merry idiotic flowers. Touch like a metronome, some sun-crushed wooden fence, another impossible lilac you remember smelling before every awful now whose clock refuses to stop or learn. Empty skull with nothing painted on the ceiling, interrupted by a signature, bright blue. There's a cabinet of unlabeled small objects in the Neuss Museum before you get to Nefertiti, and once two other tourists who were speaking another language and I were looking together at a little clay disc suspended at the end of a scrawny wire, elbowing out some pantomime of thinking, trying to determine its use, until suddenly we were slapping at each other's arms, nearly shouting, yo, 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 for children. Like children. Glass was sand, we remember, without ever having understood. Little monk pushed into rectum, ear, armpit held under your tongue or against your forehead, but only by your measure do you understand having been cold. The fingertips of your left hand under the conference room table tapping hard against your palm, I could hear the nerves shining, a cinder burning its slow hole into the carpet. The ladies of Vermeer know it's Pompeii outside, its white eye ready to name everything you failed to lose. The famous bust of Nefertiti, excavated at Tel El Amarna in 1912, lives in a bulletproof glass vitrine at the end of a long museum hallway in Berlin. Egypt asks continually for her return, and failing this, erected in 2015 an enormous concrete replica breathing down the neck of the highway entrance to the small city of Samalat, which was removed after public protests mocked its ugliness. The eyes had no irises, just two empty white ovals outlined in black, roughly the size of footballs. The original has only one eye, either the result of Thutmose the sculptor's faithful representation of the queen's absent left iris, which may itself have been the result of an ophthalmic infection common in ancient Egypt, or it got lost when we raided the tombs. Camille Paglia says the empty eyeball looks inward and is correct to point out that Western perspective is monocular and requires the removal of half the bicameral field to accept its representations as faithful. The bust is the only painted object in its gallery and stands up like a bruise on its high pedestal, spotlit out of the dark in a glass column that almost reaches the ceiling. There's a copy, a direct cast made for the blind, installed in a dark semicircular recess about 10 feet away from the original. Anyone can touch it. It's black bronze, low enough to the ground to be accessible by people who use wheelchairs, and cold enough to be mistaken for wet. If you look back over your right shoulder, you can see the original while touching the facsimile, a feeling I wish I never had. Her ears are chewed to shit. You threw all your love at now, desperate to miss and hit was, the flat plane of its cheek, the small scar you never asked about, touch it all day, it is gone. Your gifts and garbage slide to the floor and nobody gets hurt, or maybe they did, you can't remember now. Was will never give you its mouth. You only wanted to want this and want it forever and be refused, to sleep in a fist and go to the world empty as a stripped-off latex glove, inside out, eyeballs beeline for the wound like a finger trying to see. Knowing anything doesn't help. Thutmose having disappeared, leaving a crowd of anxious Germans. Nefertiti rubbing her sick eye, having disappeared, effloresced into a sign. It says stop and you don't because nobody else ever does. The Western Museological Project having delivered by sheer violence not the true property of civilization, but something roaring like a zoo and absent its mother, and already so hurt you want to go home, but this is home, and already so hurt it lets you look, and you learn to let now disappear under your tongue without noticing, like Gonzalez Torres' candy, which we know is Ross's body because that's what love is. Was. A list of names flickers across her jaw in the dark and disappears. Diogenes, on hearing Plato's definition of a man as a featherless bipedal animal, plucked a live chicken and presented it to the academy, saying, "Here is your man." You go to museums to be with other people looking, the lines of sight intersecting quietly across the stone rooms to form a net just above the field on which you mean anything. It teaches your open hands to stay empty and that words don't help. The verb tense of given the aperture will stay open long after you have left the frame, the record of your visit a smudge across a photograph that could be almost anyone. You sent me a picture of the defunct Berlin airport overrun now with starlings, fragments of old planes scattered like leaves. An adult human head weighs about 10 pounds. If nobody can touch anything, we're equal. featherless and small. The exception to the no-touch rule you were dying to break didn't help. It emptied the room and left you alone, holding a head in your hands, twisted halfway around, trying to see a face under glass 10 feet behind you, the dust particles shifting in the light, your finger wet in her ear like when your mom came home early and you two froze, knowing you were caught but that no one would say anything, not for at least a year, and that you'd do this your whole life. Touch women like a shoplifter with an eye on the door and zero regard for the consequences which you expect to be delayed, and mistaking that for freedom. You're still like a werewolf when that song comes on, but started fucking in cars, that you'd open your hands for the information and leap up guilty and over, and could touch a face for the last time without knowing it, having insisted that you'd always want to know if it was the last time, but now you are sure in the dark that you don't, because they are all still here, under your hands, their images slid 10 feet away, off register, like you really are Descartes, but you fucking hate Descartes. Your whole life is not Descartes. Newton never found anything to excise, dissect, or name, which would have ended your Holocene mercifully early, having torn open what you took and left somewhere when it got too heavy, or threw it away when you moved, or that one you kept, probably the only photograph of its face, nearly off. Punctum is the medical name for the blind spot and also a genus of snail, and everything you learn you have to keep. The Heisman Trophy of this head or Medusa's already turned to something like stone. You were only pretending to run, and now no one will stop you. Frozen mid-pivot in a posture of going away, right thumb throbbing slightly against an absence, pointed at the end zone and without a goal, stuck alone in an uncompletable perceptual operation, slumped heavily below the auditory cortex in the back wall of your brain, where everyone still is, and your breathing is loud and red because you have to admit that learning is crisis. It cracks a hole out of fullness, and you liked it there before this hallway, safe with your crude tools rubbed down to thumbs. It's a terror to follow a thought to its end. Nobody is eaten last or ever missing. Cyclops lived in a cave and the light entered its open aperture until one day Ulysses and his men wandered in and Cyclops rolled a heavy stone over the hole and trapped them inside, eating them one by one until Ulysses stabbed him in the eye and he threw aside the stone and ran out screaming and met other monsters who asked who had done this to him, and he said nobody, and they laughed and you stumbled home. Kranek's Cupid, poor thing, is blindfolded, blind, C.F. Panofsky, and sometimes covered in bees. I emailed the Noise Museum to ask if she's still there. No one wrote back. Victor Hugo, in the same century that invented history, photography, the revolver, Braille, the pencil eraser, women, rubber, and dust, wrote about the endotic, a condition of feeling the outside inside, and advocated for it against the exotic, which puts everything outside. De Chirico's late paintings of the dummies force open Hugo's idea of the body as sensitive membrane into an actual whole. The dummies facing forward, faceless, enormous, nearly skinless, their arms around each other, crouching to fit into their small rooms, their torsos open, but instead of exposed guts, there are shrapnel, bits of boat, broken columns, fractured architecture, fucked geometry. Benjamin said that about Sunday, that no room could contain it. The painter's family, the one consolation, the archaeologist, this figure lying on its side, one move and he'd overturn the whole container, overrun with world. Anthropology is what we mean and have meant. Archaeology, what we used, our verbs and materials and tools, even now, future perfect. If you feel hailed, you are. This is what it means to be interpolated. If the open guts call to you, your ears open, your hands open, and the glass breaks, and there we are laughing, fingering the broken jars, scrubbing your dishes, unstrapping a sandal, rubbing grease into the strings. You pulled your hair away from your face, addressed a small lead mirror. Hey, you. Temporary as a mouth on a cup. Phyllis Greenacre says we only cry so we don't have to see what we know isn't there. When I'm afraid the world is flat and I can't hear anything except tape hiss, the room tone turned all the way up to hide that there is nobody whispering, no breath on either ear, which drop to the floor like eggs, and not even your dog comes around to lick them up. Any other gesture too small to see from far, a votive too small to feel, you'll never read. Rubbing, measuring, weighing, unstrapping, leaning over to wipe a smudge off a kid's face, all the mom's effort getting ready to go out, small hands on the little vials and what it smelled like forever, habeas corpus. You can have it. We already took it. The boy in the Central Park 5 who opened the bruise so the blood could come out to show them. Out here we get gulls all year. Mozart kept a starling in a time when no one did this. Mozart, this terrible alertness to the natural and to what he was not, next to a cage with an ink pen, teaching a bird to sing. He recorded in his expense ledger, 27 May, 1784, starling bird, 34 kreutzer above the following transcription. There's musical notation here, which appears verbatim at the opening of the third movement of his Piano Concerto No. 17 in G, completed 3 weeks prior, excepting a G sharp, which the bird sang instead of the written G. I can't hear anything. I copied it out in silence, listening to the pen drag into the paper. I can't hear anything, even though you said anyone could do it, that you just go up and down. The starling died after 3 years, the same week as Mozart's father. You were at a funeral mass for the starling. Mozart's grave outside Vienna is marked with a prefab broken column and a fat, worried angel with stone wings, and I left half my orange there under his name and ate the other half staring at the dumb rain. Medieval scribes weren't illiterate. They were sore and worried and slow, crouched into fists under the weight of what they had to hold and couldn't hear. There's a video of a concert, the pianist the pianist's fingers alighting like birds. Frida Kahlo's chest opens to reveal the broken column of her spine, the body and face mapped everywhere by tiny nails that cast shadows that would stay there even if you came and pulled the nails out. She used her hospital gown as a smock, painting flat on her back in bed, wiping the excess from tiny brushes onto her tits. Artists' love are holes. In the mornings, the campus smells like shampoo. If you feel addressed, you are. If you feel caught, you are. If that which is after you is big, go somewhere it can't fit. If it is small, you have to keep moving so it doesn't slip inside you. You have to frighten it and hope it forgets you. Darling, darling, I don't know what a partita is. The flies died easily all summer. Over and over, I came home to find them on their backs on the windowsill, their escape frustrated by the screen with a hole in it they somehow couldn't find. Heraclitus says even the sleepers are working to keep the universe afloat. I can't do this part. It's a memorial and I'm writing a goddamn birthday. Your name and bird shit on the windshield still too wet to wipe away. Rodin's lovers aren't two, they're one. One act cut from a single stone, like he flung back the sheets and found them, and all the light shot on and split them apart, subtracting from one to get to almost two. Wake up, we're here. You were naming the parts in your sleep. Hip, shoulder, neck, mouth, thumb, palm, stone. A pelvis lifts and never comes down. God is a verb, but the verb is love, and love takes away. It removes the stone, and the dead are out walking, their bashed feet floating a few inches above the field. To apprehend means to be caught and to be held, and I understand. Rodin knew you can't see anything unless it's leaving, and I'm in Harlem touching the big wet rocks at the edge of the river, light rain, saying, darling, darling, we're in there, and no one can see us. No one will come with his little hammers to give us a hell where we are set free. They used to argue there were no skyscrapers in Midtown Manhattan because the bedrock was too soft to support their erection, but actually it was an issue of demand. We build where there is space, perilously upward, and keep our footprint small, and the cracks form underneath the porcelain, and our arms break off, and then we are sure we have learned something. It's the air holds things up, not the stone. If we all stay together, we'll never know if we're sinking. You were shouting, I love you, Dana, into the phone. Everything was lying there dead, flat on their backs on the windowsill, one after another, all of the words like flies or birds slapping at the glass, over and over, same bird, over and over, love. Love torched the field and is the opposite of hope. Two broken off arms held against the back of a figure, kneeling, the map you stare at expecting it to change. Nut's body shudders and all the leaves drop at once, everywhere. Fra Angelico's frescoes at the convent of San Marco were made to help quiet the monks, his little brothers. St. Dominic appears in almost all of them as a guide, variously holding flowers, kneeling, soaking up Christ's blood with his robes, holding a small book, a witness that no one else in the picture can see. He is marked each time by a small red asterisk, a hole independent of the action, a ghost blown backwards from now into these scenes, unable to intercede but able to show you how to behave in face of 1,000 years later. Fresco is painted directly onto wet plaster, and when it dries, it becomes the wall. The hairline cracks web calmly across book, face, veil, halo. One each for the monks' vaulted cells, attendant to their devotions and refusals. Each scene goes on, a pedagogical metronome. You, not there, contemplate that it took place without you, that it isn't what you would have done, but you were under glass always in face of ordinary and extraordinary acts. Poor little world, it's not even time until it was. The mocking of Christ in cell number 7 is missing almost everything but its verbs. Two figures set gently at the foot of a few stairs, each touching their own face, one looking away and another reading, a small red asterisk floating just above his halo. Above them, Jesus is seated, blindfolded against a soft green field, holding an orb and a stick. The action of the mockers is represented by a face in profile lifting his cap to spit, and 5 floating hands slapping at their target, bodiless, so as not to distract the monks from their task of mourning or of service. Who can say, hold still? You have to move the cup, Dana, you have to move the cup. Fermata, that bird's eye shape, overturned, over nothing. Almost everything is where you left it. The work doesn't just work when you're standing there. One huge chlorinated pool with everyone I ever loved standing in it, neck deep, a few feet apart, holding up their babies if they have them, wet heads above water bleaching in the sun. So quiet, just standing there. Maya Lin got this right, that you can't read anyone's name and see your reflection at the same time. You walk towards the wall to meet you, and when you get there, the name breathes you in, taking the world with it, its green flicking off, each finger a wet Ziploc with a snapshot inside. That was Nefertiti for the Blind by Dana DeGiulio, read by the artist, published February 2019 by Attendant, recorded December 5th, 2019, for my mother and the spider.